So this week we'll talk about how contemporary groups affect EPDs. So just a basic review of what a contemporary group is. Contemporary group is a set of same-sex calves born around the same time, managed the same since birth, and each group in the calf, or each calf in the group, has received the same opportunity to express its genetic potential. What is the purpose of a contemporary group? So it allows for comparison of animals that were raised together, and it's also used in the calculation of EPDs. It is the environmental factor in the EPD calculation. It's the environmental factor in anything to deal with phenotype, actually. So phenotype is the genotype plus the environment. EPDs are that environmental factor because every animal in a contemporary group is in the same environment when it's raised. The use of EPDs, or use of the contemporary group in EPD calculation, we use differences within the group in that EPD calculation. So if we're looking at yearling weights, for example, and we've got an 800 and an 850 pound yearling weight, that is going to be the same as a 750 and an 800 pound yearling weight. We look at that difference of 50 pounds. And so here a little while later, what I'll do is I will get into a simulation and run some different scenarios with animals in contemporary groups to show how they affect EPDs and how those differences are what we're really looking at. So EPDs are calculated using Henderson's mixed model equations. It's a bunch of matrices, but what goes into it, you've got performance, pedigree, and then contemporary groups. And what we use now is what we call single step, because we include that genomic data. But again, you can still see the contemporary groups are in there as your environmental effect. So we use contemporary groups to take out environment. And when we look at this, again, make sure that we record everything in a contemporary group. So say we've got 15 animals that are born that could be that are in a contemporary group. We got 15 heifer calves, and they're born, and we wean those heifer calves, and we get that adjusted data. We use the adjusted data in this calculation, and they range anywhere from 444 pounds to 656 pounds. So you can see your average is 543 pounds. So anything above that's going to ratio more. You'll see an increase in the EPD of anything that has above 543 pound adjusted weaning weight in this contemporary group. Anything below, we'll see a little drop in the EPD. That base EPD is based on the parents and other animals that are related to that animal. And so here, say we culled anything under 550 pounds, well, then you see that you have to be over 606 pounds, and you're not going to see as big of an increase in your EPD in these upper ones or as big of a decrease in the lower ones, because we've biased that data by culling out and removing the lower end. So it's important to record everything in order to get EPDs that truly represent the genetics that are going on and the genetic potential that certain animals have. So the next slide, I'm going to stop sharing this screen for a little bit, and we're going to look at some EPD examples. I've got a sample simulation of EPDs that we'll look at real quick. So does everybody see this screen? on EPD calculations. So what we're going to do here is you've got 3 different contemporary groups. You got animals 1 through 6. Animals 1 and 2 are in a contemporary group, 3 and 4 are in a contemporary group, and then 5 and 6 are in a contemporary group. Now these animals are all related, but they're not inbred. And so example 1 and example 2 are showing what I talked about, that the difference is what's used in the calculation of EPD. So if you look, animal 1 has a yearling weight of 800 pounds and animal 2, 900. So there's a 100-pound difference there. There's 100 pounds between 3 and 4, and then 100 or 50 pounds between 5 and 6. Excuse me. And so these are your EPDs, calculated EPDs for these animals. Now there is some relation to the animals, so that's why you don't see the 100-pound difference making the exact same EPDs in animal 3 and 4 as you do 1 and 2. But if we take this example 2, which has the exact same differences of 100 pounds, 100 pounds, and 50 pounds, paste this over into the yearling weight, you see we don't see any difference in those EPDs. Those EPDs are the same whether we recorded a 900-pound yearling weight and an 800-pound or an 800-pound and a 700-pound. And that can change, and it varies. You know, the bigger your contemporary group, the more differences you can have. And so you'll see more variation in the EPDs. This is an extremely simple example of EPDs. Now this example 3 right here, excuse me, we see that same 100-pound difference in animals 1 and 2. Animals 3 and 4 weigh the same. Animals 5 and 6 weigh the same. And so you actually see the EPDs change, and a lot of that is because of the relatedness of the animals. Example 4, what we're going to do is just reduce the differences in those EPDs. So we have a 25-pound difference instead of a 100-pound difference, a 10-pound difference instead of a 100-pound difference, and a 25-pound difference instead of a 50-pound difference. So we see those expected differences, because that's what EPD is an expected progeny difference. We see a big shrinkage in those expected progeny differences when those animals are all closer together. So think about that example I had on the computer where I looked at the whole contemporary group and recording it versus just recording the top end. And if you think about that, when I record just the top end, think that those differences get smaller and smaller. So your change, your EPDs, there's not as much difference there. Think of these first few examples where there's that 100-pound difference. Well, that's comparing that really lightweight animal to that heavyweight animal. And then example 5 is if everything got turned in and adjusted to the same weights within their contemporary groups, and this would be the same for a single because there's no difference to compare to, we have no expected progeny difference. So we go in, if you can look at this, this is the back side of everything. This is Henderson's mixed model equations. These are all different matrices that go into calculating that. Over here, this matrix right here, that's the relationship matrix that shows how related everything is. So relatedness as well as the difference. And the difference is what we're really focused on in the EPDs, is what makes the biggest changes. And That's where we see the change in the EPDs is the difference in those animals, in those contemporary groups. Because the contemporary groups are taking out environment, everything, trying to make everything genetic and relate it back to the genetics. So I've talked for a little bit, 10, 12 minutes. What I'd like to do now is entertain any questions that anybody may have about contemporary groups and EPDs. So again, feel free to use the Q&A session down at the bottom of your screen. Ask us any questions that you may have. Anybody have any questions? I know it was a brief, quick run through. It was kind of my eye. All right. So I got a question. What factor does DNA play in the EPD formula? Okay, so if you go into the EPD formula, when you run your DNA, you're getting parentage as well as markers. That little matrix that I showed you up in the top right-hand corner of the simulator, that was the relationship matrix and showed by pedigree, we estimated those animals to be that related to each other. What DNA does is using all those markers, we, excuse me, we know how related those animals are. And there's actually a manipulation of that matrix that makes it more accurate by knowing what those markers are and how related those animals actually are. I got a question for the recorded webinar. The recorded webinar will be available after it's downloaded. We will get it out there just like we did with last week's. The recorded webinar will be available after all of this is done. Okay, so I got a question about those animals in the sample, or the example that I did. They weren't inbred, and so what factor does inbreeding have on EPDs? So basically, inbreeding is going to set genetics. You're going to have more homozygosity because of inbreeding than you would with non-inbred animals. You're going to have more homozygosity. So inbreeding is going to go into that matrix, that one that I showed you. And what that really does is show the accuracy of the animal. So you see more improved accuracy with some inbreeding. You will see a change in the EPDs because that relationship does affect those animals. You'd have to go back in and change that matrix, but it would be you'd just see some differences in those EPDs because of inbreeding. I can't tell you whether they'd go up or they'd go down. It just depends on what the trait is, how the animals perform, but it'll also offer a little bit more accuracy because with that, we know that with knowing the inbreeding, we know that we have more relatedness, so we have some more accuracy. I hope that was understandable. Okay, we got another question. When contemporary group is a set of embryo calves that are full brothers and sisters, how does relatedness factor differ in the example you showed versus more distantly related calves? So those animals that are full embryos or full siblings because they're embryos, if we estimate their relatedness, we estimate our relatedness with our siblings at about half. Now, knowing pedigree and everything, we can update that and know that it's more than a half in terms of relatedness. Distantly related cattle, animals that aren't as related, when they go in, it all goes into that A matrix, or that additive genetic matrix that shows us the relatedness. So you may not see as much of a difference in accuracy in those animals that are less related. And full sibs, another question that's common is, well, I have a bunch of embryo calves, why aren't their EPDs the same? Well, if you go and you look, those animals were born at different weights. Those animals had different ratios within that contemporary group. And so there's some differences there. I know my sister and I aren't a contemporary group, but if you look at us, you see similarities, but there's also some big differences in my sister and I. So that's why calves that are embryo calves are not always the same EPDs. So I got a question, are closed herd EPDs more accurate than non-closed herd? So actually that's kind of a hard question to answer. The more accurate EPDs are actually animals that touch more animals throughout the entire breed's pedigree. So if you have a closed herd, you can build up the accuracy and everything, but an animal that's touched more animals throughout the herd, so a widely used semen sire is going to be more accurate than an animal that's within a closed herd and only used in that closed herd. So I got a question about calves being in 2 separate pastures until weaning and then they're combined. What effect does combining calves at weaning have on the contemporary group? So you can actually combine, at birth, you can combine different contemporary groups of cows. If you keep them in 2 groups on separate pastures until weaning, those are going to be 2 separate contemporary groups that will never be able to be combined. So your weaning contemporary group is what we base yearling and scan data contemporary groups off of. So you can only get smaller after the weaning group. You can never get larger. So I got a question about beef master breeders using EPDs on their ranches programs. So EPDs are a tool, like any other tool that's out there. I like to compare using EPDs with visual appraisal to building a house. If I'm building a house, I'm not going to go in with just a hammer to build that entire house. I'm going to have saws and other tools as well to build that house. So using EPDs helps to increase the genetics in your herd, but also make sure that you have an animal that's acceptable to you in the way that it looks. I hope that answered that question. So we got some more time. I'd like to invite Dusty to ask some questions, or we'll discuss some, I guess, common questions that he and I get on the road when we're talking to individuals about EPDs, since I don't have any other questions. As questions pop up, I'll answer those as well. But Dusty, what are some common questions you get?
You know, Lance, I believe that the question about embryo calves was very relevant. You know, we have calves that should be exactly the same and they're not. But I also get asked, hey, I've got a set of calves that are 3/4 siblings, half siblings, etc. You know, how different will those calves end up? And I think that it's very similar to the embryo calf question, but do you see anything different there besides maybe that quarter of the pedigree being different?
I don't, on the relatedness, there's not a lot of difference unless you dive into DNA. Once we dive into DNA and start using single step blood, like the first question I got about how DNA comes in, then we really see some differences because, you know, the relatedness of a full sibling, you could get theoretically every single one of the same genes from your father and your mother and be identical. Or you could get every single different gene from your father and mother and be almost unrelated. Now, that happening is highly unlikely. Either one of those is very highly unlikely. So if we, looking at animals that are closely related, that is the big question, Dusty, is why, well, these are closely related. Why are their EPDs so different? And most of the time, and the answer is, well, how did that animal perform compared to its contemporary group? Especially if those two animals are in the same contemporary group, well, then you're going to see a big difference in them because those two animals are in the same contemporary group, and you're looking at the difference between those two animals and seeing that genetic difference between those two half sibs or 3/4 sibs or those embryo calves. If they're in different contemporary groups and one outperforms everything else, well, his EPDs will go up, and the other one doesn't outperform, their EPDs will go down.
Okay. I also get one fairly often that really it's kind of like two questions that you can wrap into the same. We commonly see single animal contemporary groups. And then I get asked commonly, well, if I have more calves, you know, what's going to be the difference between having a bunch of calves in one contemporary group or having just one?
Okay, so the difference is that last example I showed where there was absolutely no difference between any of those animals in any of the contemporary groups, your EPDs went to 0. So if you have one animal in a contemporary group, say we're looking at yearling weight, well, you've got one animal in that contemporary group. The contemporary group average for yearling weight is 900. Well, that animal's the 900-pound animal. 900 minus 900 is 0. I mean, there's no difference. That animal ratio is right at 100 because there's no difference between that animal and the contemporary group average.
Another thing that I see or hear as we start seeing more bull tests come through or commingled bulls that go into a program and eventually end up at a sale, you know, you hear a lot about the test ratios. And I believe that there could be some confusion in the ratios and differences on a test with, let's say, 100 commingled bulls comprised of, you know, 3 or 4 different owners. Did those play any effect on an actual EPD, or is that just something that, you know, we can look at from that test?
That's something we can look at from that test because that's specific to that test. We look at those animals on that test and we can compare those test ratios with a grain of salt. Because the way I like to compare this is contemporary group, you have to stay in from weaning all the way through the end. We have to compare those test ratios with a grain of salt because say you took me and you raised me until I was 18, 19 years old at my house, and you took somebody with the same genetics and same genetic potential from a country, third world country that doesn't have the availability of nutrients that I had over here. We grow up the same, or I grow up, I'm bigger than that individual. So we go to compete in something that's based on strength or something that I grew up doing, I'm going to outperform that animal every time, or that person, sorry, I said animal. I'm going to outperform that person every time because I've had the opportunity, a different opportunity to genetically express myself than that person. So it's the same with animals. So those animals that are weaned together, they all had the same opportunity to express themselves genetically compared to another producer who, while it may be a similar environment, it's not exactly the same. I hope that kind of cleared some stuff up there. I do have another question. We have some popular sires with very low EPDs. Will their progeny ever be able to improve their EPDs, or will their bloodline always be in the lower percentile? So those animals that have lower EPDs, they will always have lower EPDs, but their progeny, this is where, you know, if it's a bloodline you like to use and produces animals that are phenotypically what you want, find you an animal that complements them on the EPD side and use that animal to help bring those progenies EPDs up. Also, make sure that those progeny are in contemporary groups. Don't do single contemporary groups like Dusty and I were just talking about. That's one of the biggest problems is single contemporary groups, and we don't get any usable data from single contemporary groups. So you can bring the progeny up. It's a slow process, but it can happen. Another thing I want to remind you of, if you go on to you log into your herd on the BBU system and you go to reports, you can pull a EPD report. You can look at that report. It'll give you all your animals, list out your animals. You can do it by year. You can do it by your active animals. It'll list all those animals and you can look at their EPDs. You can look at performance reports by sire and performance reports by dam. So if you have any of those questions, feel free to give me a call at the office, give Dusty a call, shoot us an email. We can walk through and work through things like that with you. I'm trying to help you. If you've got questions on where to go, what kind of decisions to make, how this is going to affect you, we can help you out with that. So feel free to give us a call on any of that if you have any questions. Next week, we will have another presenter, so we won't actually have me. We'll have Dr. Kai Poehler from Texas A&M. He'll be talking about repro, different synchronization protocols that you can utilize. So we're excited to have him. I'm going to try to have more and more guest speakers. Texas is opening back up. I'm going to try to continue these webinars around this lunchtime if they work for everybody. I think it's a good way to kind of engage yourself and get away from whatever else that you may be doing. A lot of you, cattle is your passion. It's what you like to do, but your real job is somewhere in an office building, and it gets kind of monotonous. So I think I'd like to continue this and continue this educational series for a while and have guest speakers as well as myself. If you have any suggestions on topics you'd like covered that you think people may have questions about, feel free to give us a call, shoot me an email, and we can work on that. May not be me covering that topic, it may be somebody else. But I appreciate everybody joining today. Thank y'all for taking 30 minutes out of your day to listen to us talk about this and going through the education. This has been recorded, so again, like the last presentation we did, it will be posted for everyone to see, and Dusty and I will do a recap after that. We'll do a recap of last week sometime this week. So thanks again for joining, and Hope everybody got a little bit of information from this.